Hello, welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development. We're in Sevilla for the International Conference for Financing for Development. I'm with global development reporters Elissa, Miolene, and Chase-Lubitz. And this is the final day of the conference, and there has been an agreement on the Compromiso de Sevilla. Compromiso in Spanish means commitment, but many people are saying this is a compromise. Elissa, what are the kind of major talking points within this document that they agreed?
Yeah, so you're completely right, Tom. I mean, this idea of a compromise has been a lot of what we've heard, but at the same time, it depends who you ask. Some people are really, really pleased with the outcome. Other people see it as a little bit disappointing, not ambitious enough. But essentially, the main bits and pieces that we've been able to pull away that are the guiding forces of this document are there's a lot on debt. So not so much as debt cancellation or other things that folks would have liked to see, but there is a creation of a borrowers group. So this is a way for borrowing countries to elevate their voices, and also a debt registry, which is aimed to build transparency of debt, who owns it, who gives it out. Then there's also quite a bit on tax, which we can get into further. There's quite a bit on climate, which Jesse will take over. And of course, there's always, as there seems to be frequently in these types of conferences, discussion on MDB reform, multilateral development bank reform. So I would say those are kind of the major buckets, along with bits and pieces here and there of other things.
Yeah, I just to kind of pop in there, I think that the distinguishment between commitment and compromise is really interesting because I think a lot of people don't actually feel like it was a huge compromise, surprisingly. There was a lot of positivity from the people that we've talked to, both developed and developing countries. They feel like, you know, the main sort of line is we didn't get everything we wanted, but this is a great step forward. And Sevilla was always supposed to be a starting point. The agreement was already decided on before we got here. And so it seems like people are leaving feeling very hopeful.
I know a lot of people are just criticizing the document because there were a lot of words in it. The wording was, for example, someone mentioned that there are too many words like encourage and encourage and encourage rather than actual concrete action. But what are some of the things that you think will come out of this conference?
The interesting thing that I think set this week apart that a lot of people were quite pleased with was the Sevilla Platform for Action. So this was kind of in one separate room throughout the entire conference. There was a deluge of initiatives and launches, and some of them weren't necessarily launched today, but it was a promotion of efforts and different kind of things like that. So the whole point of this Sevilla Platform for Action, which folks also refer to as the SPA, which who knows, but it really was to drive implementation forward. Like Jesse said, this is a document and a conference that's meant to set a norm, set a standard for the next decade. But I think these bits and pieces were to really drive forward some initiatives. So those were different things like, the Borrowers Club was one of those things. There were so many, I think 170. So quite a lot of different initiatives. I think 11 were specifically on debt. So lots of different stuff in the mix there.
Yeah, I think I know we've mentioned Borrowers Club already, but I think it's really important. A lot of the people I've talked to are very happy with this. And it's basically, it's a place for the main borrowing countries of the world to come together and talk about what they need on debt and to create a demand that's uniform so that you don't have a lot of differentiation between different countries asking, we want this and we want that. The main thing on debt when we came here was developing countries said the current framework is not transparent. It's not fast enough. We want a new framework. And developed countries said that's going to make this more complicated. Let's try and fix the one we have. And so, the Borrowers Club is a place for them to move that conversation forward. Just kind of going back to what you were saying on the wording, especially on climate, it was very, very watered down, and that was because the U.S. really stayed in the process until the very last minute, and then they left. Climate, we don't have, a big new document, but the feeling among experts here is that that's not really for Sevilla. That's a UNFCCC. That's what we deal with in the UNFCCC. We could talk about COP in a little bit. But I think for debt, as we said, and also for tax, for the last decade, countries have been asking for a UN convention on tax. They still they didn't quite get it yet. But I just talked to somebody who said, we are going to get that. And it's going to be decided in the UN, and it's going to be decided soon. And so that's another piece of hopeful news.
And regarding climate and climate resilience, there has been in this conversation I've been hearing from various participants and experts of having more local ownership in climate finance and also encouraging climate investment. So rather than just climate funding, but climate and seeing it as an investment. You had the opportunity to interview COP30 President Andre Correa del Lago. What were some of your key takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah. Okay. So many elements of that I want to comment on. I might forget one of them, but with the COP30 president, we did talk a lot about COP30 more than Sevilla, obviously, but he was really here to make friends. Is sort of how I summarized it. He's trying to. I mean, Brazil, obviously, like every country, wants a really successful COP, and this is all about diplomacy. And so he was here to talk to people about their plans. What's a really interesting kind of parallel element of this conference and COP30 is that they're both putting so much emphasis on implementation. Brazil has already said this is an implementation COP. It's not about the document. They're probably going to do a very similar thing where agreements are made before we even get there. And then we talk about implementation. So there's some really interesting, it's a nice road that we can follow from now to then, from last COP to then. On private investment or investments and local leadership, those two things are huge themes here. Within the Compromiso document, there's several times in which we see language saying governments, local developing country governments need to be at the forefront of their own development plans, and everyone's really happy with that as well. The question is obviously how do we get the money? And so that's where the private-public partnership thing comes in, which is, we've had the International Business Forum literally right next door. It's not even a different conference, I would say. And there's just been a ton of discussions on how to mobilize private finance, how to use public finance to de-risk it. And really interestingly, a lot of people have been saying that it's the perception of risk. These countries are not even that risky. There's a huge amount of development happening in the developed world. And so if we can just change the perception of it, the private organization, the private companies will come in. But, I don't know about, a solid takeaway of moving forward after this, right? These are a lot of conversations are happening here on the public-private partnership side. But I don't think, come Monday, we'll really, immediately see a huge amount of investment. I think there's still a long way to go on that.
So what I will say is I just got off, right before this podcast recording, I just got off a phone call with someone in the private sector who was just saying, frankly, the amount of interest was just so high in terms of the people wanting to talk to the private sector, engage with the private sector. And he said quite a number of handshakes were made here at Sevilla and quite a number of deals that, again, it's not necessarily like they're doing something now and going to embark on a massive investment, but they're making these partnerships and kind of carrying it forward in the months and weeks to come. I think another interesting thing too is I wasn't quite sure how the feel of private sector and development and especially climate would be going into this conference, given kind of political headwinds and a pullback of climate in the U.S. Speaking anecdotally as journalists who are going to be publicizing things like this, got quite a lot of interview requests from people wanting to talk in the private sector about the climate work they're doing, the sustainable development work they're doing, the DFI work that they're doing. So that was just something that kind of stood out to me a little bit, that there is an appetite still, regardless of kind of, me based in Washington and hearing and seeing about all of the different pullbacks. They're certainly not gone in Sevilla. And
just a really quick ad before we go to your next question. I was talking to somebody today and I said, it sounds like you're this is a crazy way to frame this, but that the ODA, draw has the silver lining of, it being a moment where we're really putting emphasis on private. And obviously there is a long list of issues with that. Accountability, transparency, actual mobilization in the really vulnerable countries. But we were talking about private finance in the last Financing for Development conference in 2015, and then nothing really happened. And so there is, from what we're hearing at least, and these are from, people having the conversations, is maybe we've been forced into this situation because ODA has dropped, where we have to do a lot more with a lot less money.
Yeah. And I think we've been reporting for the past couple of years, and ODA has been dropping everywhere. And, the elephant in the room, or rather not, was the US's absence in this conference. And there was real kind of push for public-private cooperation in this conference.
Yeah.
And I actually spoke to former UNGA President Csaba Kőrösi, who was saying that rather than this conference was not necessarily about, mobilizing funds. So Addis Ababa was about from billions to trillions, but here it was more about actually impact investment and making sure where we're investing, we're having meaningful change. And it's kind of a reorientation of like how we see global development and foreign aid. And my question is, do you think this conference will be a trendsetter? Will it help form the dialogue and shape conversations in upcoming events such as UNGA in New York in a couple of months and COP?
Yeah, I actually have been thinking about this quite a lot because, again, the U.S. has pulled out, right? And as Jesse mentioned, kind of the government watered down the document quite a bit with various, I think our colleague counted like 400 different amendments the U.S. put in, and then they left. And I think the resounding thing that I keep hearing from folks, private, public, UN here, is the world's continuing to move on. And I think that it's like, yeah, it's going to be hard. The biggest economy's out of the room and the biggest donor is out of the room. But I don't think that it's necessarily, it's just going to change the game. It's not like people are giving up. I think we're past that a little bit now. After the first 6 months, things have settled. USAID's officially gone. So now what happens is that the world is kind of picking itself up and moving on. I think, again, Jesse and I both many times this week have heard people say, well, we got an outcome document. Multilateralism lives.
Yeah.
And for us at first, we were like, gosh, that's a really base level satisfaction. Yeah, the low bar. But the more I kind of heard it, the more I understood. It's like, all right, it's more of a pickup moment after 6 months of global upheaval. And now moving forward and seeing what's next. And perhaps there'll be other actors that fill that gap. And maybe that might come from the global south itself.
Yeah. Yeah, we both actually had a really fascinating conversation with someone who said, the diplomacy is slow and we haven't had a World War III, and like there's a lot of issues with it and we all want it to move faster. But we can't just be mad about it because it's not going fast enough. But I do think it's important to remember that, if you talk to anybody about 2015, they were really hopeful too. And they left feeling like this was the peak of multilateralism. And when we came into this conference, everyone was like, yeah, that was the peak and this is the valley. And, I don't know if we kind of climbed back up this mountain need to move away from the metaphor, but, I just worry that, the hopefulness could fade. And it's really hard to know if we're going to see it come through at UNGA and COP and stuff like that.
I had two very interesting interviews actually this week, which linked into this legacy of this conference. One was with former Czech Prime Minister Jan Fischer. And he said, 10-year interval for these conferences is not enough. We're going to lose hope. We're not going to make any progress. We had Addis Ababa. The world is changing so quickly. We have no idea what's going to happen. But then I also had a conversation literally 5 minutes later with former Serbian President Boris Tadic. And he was saying, yes, in that 10-year period, yeah, it's going to be very difficult what's going to come, but we have to think of all the positive innovation that might come out of this. So, for example, in 2015, we would have had no idea how AI can transform the global development sector, the way we are able to get data on the ground and process that data so quickly. Especially with these funding cuts, when they're cutting stuff, maybe we can use innovation to overcome the shortages. So going forward, I know you'll be going to COP, and climate finance has been a big conversation. And at UNGA, this will be a big topic. Do you think we should be having these conversations more often, or do you think that the current setup of the global development calendar is sufficient for this?
It's a hard question. I mean, I think it's kind of nice to have one so far apart. Like so many of the others are every year, and there's something scale because development, and especially climate development, is about the long term. And I do think we often lack that long term thinking when we're considering financing. So I think there's benefit to it on that front. And I think your point about technology is really interesting because the same goes for climate, right? Like we've gotten, we can all hate on how slow the reaction is on climate change, but like the solar industry has absolutely transformed in less than 10 years. And so what we can do with that is a whole lot different. I also think, when we talk about investment in least developed countries or middle income countries, someone was telling me today that they have more digital capability to be able to use that money in a different way. And so now the public-private conversations that they're having, there's more to show private companies that, you know, we can do what we can do with your money, basically. So, I mean, I'm guessing this really long arch.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's also there's so many different, there's COP, there's UNGA, Jesse was just at Bonn. So there's a million different conferences that are going at the same time. Having this Financing for Development Summit this year in 2025 felt really impactful. I think it was a moment, like a crunch moment for this sector, right? And so it came luckily it didn't come in February, and luckily it didn't come, frankly, any later, right? Because I feel like now, like I said earlier, the world is kind of picking itself back up and figuring out what to do next with development, with growth, with aid. So it seemed to come at quite the right time.
We had a lot of stories, if you've been reading our newsletters, of our experience of getting around the city. Elissa, can you just explain how our experience actually in Sevilla was reporting from this conference?
Sure. So whoever chose Sevilla in late June, early July, we have questions. It was 109 degrees at some points.
It's 115 degrees.
115. It's unclear if that's what it
Fair.
could have been 115 degrees here. So it was hot. And it was also really, really difficult navigating the city. So I feel like everyone kind of joined together around this shared hatred of the traffic and the heat and just like how difficult it was to get here and the taxis dropping you off 20 minutes from the conference venue. So that was kind of the color of what it felt like to be here. On a more serious note, there was quite a lot of frustration and discontent coming from the civil society sector. And I think that's important to note because civil society plays an essential role in many of these conversations and discussions representing civil society. We had many conversations with folks who were very frustrated by access issues. So I went to one press conference that was hosted by civil society. Apparently they had taken months to get this one particular room. And then on the morning of the conference, it was then brought to a different room. And then we were brought back to the same room. And then that took about 20 minutes. And then by the time the journalist tried to get into that room, we were blocked from entering until kind of a fuss was created. And then we finally got in. So that was kind of one example that I saw in real life about how the frustrations that they had told Jesse and I that they were dealing with for several months. I think that it marks just kind of this feeling that is often at these conferences that just like there isn't enough space carved out for civil society. Which again was something that we kept hearing from people, not just from one organization or another, but it seemed like many, many, many networks.
Yeah. I mean, compared to the climate conferences, which I think have a really different vibe anyway, because there's just so many young people and it's such an activist-like space, it felt way more controlled. I mean, there was one very planned protest today. That was the only protest we saw. We were told that they weren't allowed to protest even outside the venue. Not that you want to in this heat, but, so there's that. And journalists were also controlled as far as entering the areas where real like negotiations were happening. So there's the first sort of center where you can access side events and the International Business Forum, but everything, like including plenaries, roundtables, just like announcements of new initiatives in the Sevilla Platform for Action is in a different section with a very rigorous checkpoint process where like every single card is seen, and we had to be escorted by someone from the media group by the UN basically in order to get anywhere. And so I found that very frustrating. There also just weren't that many journalists here, which I think is really interesting. So we have this like really massive media room and it's largely empty. And I think that's partly because, you know, I do wonder, like, if we had more journalists here, I think that would have been a huge frustration for a bigger kind of like news story.
Right.
So yeah, as far as, you know, there was a lot of positivity, but there were a lot of things that fell short, and it's very hard to tell why, you know, like if this was a UN thing, if this was a Spain thing, if this was a logistics thing. I don't think that's quite clear at this point.
And yeah, I've been to Geneva to the World Health Assembly, and there it was very much more simple for journalists to get in. So
yeah.
It was quite a shock to me. But it was interesting regardless, like all the side conversations that were taking place within the venue, they were very interesting. And I feel as though a lot of the next steps that will be happening, or some of the ideas will be coming out from those side events rather than actually the main conference. So finish on a more positive note. Hopefully that will help shape future conversations in the sector as well. But for now, I think it's time to go. I think you've got some reporting to do, and I have to run to the airport as well, and then write some articles as well. But thank you very much for your time. This was another episode of This Week in Global Development. And yeah, see you next week.
Thank you.